This is the sixth video that I'm making in support of my book, 21 Steps to Nirvana. But rather than just talk about the book or support the book, I want to open a new topic, and that is the self. And if you are familiar with Advaita Vedanta, then you know that the ultimate goal of all your spiritual striving is the self. And the question is how to become one with it. Ramana, who is of course my ultimate guru, because he is the guru of my guru's guru. Ramana, of course, uses a Tamil expression, and that Tamil expression is as plain as the gooseberry in one's palm. And if you compare it to the English saying, as plain as the hand in front of your face, they probably mean one and the same thing. But the idea being that the self is as obvious as the hand in front of your face, and similarly, if you were to use a Tamil expression, the self is as obvious, as plain as it is not hidden. You put a gooseberry in your palm, you're going to see it, and that's what the self is. And it seems like a lot of hard work to find and see and become and be the self. Because if it's so obvious, then the question obviously arises that why is it not obvious to most of us? And of course, to use another expression in English, that the best place to hide something is in plain sight. And so it's something like that, that it is so in plain sight that we take it for granted, and so much so that we cannot see it, or we cannot distinguish it as a experience. We find it difficult to experience it in its purity. And of course, again, Ramana points out that the only way to know the self is to see it. The only way to know the self is to be it. It is not sufficient to see it. And the fact that I misspoke shows how confusing it could be. So it's not sufficient to have a theoretical understanding of the self. It's also incorrect to expect that once one sees the self and its effects, that in itself is sufficient. So intellectually knowing the self is certainly not sufficient, and intellectually seeing the self or noticing its effects is also inadequate. And Ramana makes that very clear that if we just merely intellectually understand or see the self, then the reason it is inadequate is that you cannot experience the power of the self, and again here we run into semantics. How can I say you cannot experience the power of the self? So the semantics actually gives us a good hint in finding the self, and that hint is that the self is right here, right now, and it is not some mysterious quantity that will come to you, or it is not an entity that will float in and possess you once you are realized. On the other hand, it is the most natural experience in the world that the self is. Again, going back to semantics, we use the word casually in everyday language. I am myself, who else can I be? And in our sophisticated intellectual way, we distinguish the casual word of the used self with the more spiritual implication of the term self. But in fact, there is little difference, and perhaps you can compare it to if you're on Earth, which we all are. You refer to the sun, and you say, well, the sun is shining down on all of us, and the perspective you have is, of course, standing on Earth and having the sun spread its light over half of the earth at any time. And if you can transfer your consciousness to the sun, and you're looking down on the earth this time, rather than up at the sun, then if you are the sun, and of course I'm referring to the S-O-S-U-N, sun, if you are the sun, then you have a totally different perspective, because you are the sun, you are the light, you are the consciousness. And when you were on earth, you were partaking of that consciousness because the light was reaching you. But what in fact you are being asked to do is become the light itself. And here I am not drawing distinctions between the light and the sun itself, and at least to most of us the sun is light itself. They are one and the same thing. We sometimes refer to the self, the spiritual self, as the conscious self. You say things like, I am the conscious self. And this is interesting because consciousness is the self. And just like we enjoy the light of the sun, we seem to enjoy the consciousness of the self. And thus you can make the comparison that of becoming the sun versus basking in the sun's rays. And it seems like an almost impossible transition to make. But in fact it is very intuitive and very correct, very appropriate. So we seem to be approaching the topic, dancing around it, but the metaphor here that we seem to be developing is that light is consciousness. I mean, in a very rough sense, light is awareness of one's surroundings. Light allows you to see, and in the darkness, it's not that objects do not exist, objects are yet there, but consciousness or awareness or light brings them into our awareness, brings these objects into our awareness, and we become conscious of them. So there seems to be a four-stage process. One is that objects exist, or the world out there exists. That is, that we are now talking about the subject-object relationship. And anything that is not the subject is the object. And so if we look out and we see, well, okay, the objects exist, I become aware of them because of a certain thing called light, a certain thing perhaps called the human awareness, and that is an awareness that we seem to share even with animals. After all, the animals too are aware of the world around them. But then you do take another step beyond that, and you posit, you believe that there is a consciousness seeing or looking at this awareness or experiencing this awareness, this consciousness is what makes the world literally come alive or into existence. And perhaps the difference would be between robot vision. Yes, certainly robots connected to computers can see, but are they aware in the sense of are they conscious? And at least the answer in 2016, this is the last day of 2016. I don't know what will happen next year, but in 2016 robots are not independently aware. And we don't know how to do that, or we haven't succeeded in doing that yet. So there is this mysterious quantity called consciousness, and it's what defines us as humans. It's what separates us from animals. And we can understand that some animals do have that consciousness of self. And suddenly the word self comes in. But to test whether the animal has self-consciousness, consciousness of existence as a separate entity, then they sometimes present the animal, whether it's a dolphin or a chimpanzee, or perhaps even a dog or an elephant. These are the usual candidates, or a squid. These are the usual candidates that are presented with a mirror. And if they can recognize themselves, and they have some complicated experiments to make that obvious to us, that yes, this particular animal recognizes itself. And for example, if you put a puppy in front of a mirror, the puppy will bark at the other puppy in the mirror and try to play with it. Whereas perhaps a more mature dog will not. The more mature dog will recognize that what it is looking at is a mirror image of itself. And here's the word self again. So again, we've succeeded in dancing around the concept of self, but this time from a slightly different angle. The angle being the word itself. And we connected it to this metaphor of light and consciousness, awareness and self-awareness. And of course all these terms are used loosely most of the time, but we need to be careful to find out what exactly is the difference between the use of the word awareness, the use of the word consciousness, and are we just splitting hairs, or in fact this is essential to our understanding. And my point is, of course, that all these arguments are in fact moot once you experience the self. And what is the experience of self? And at least for me, the self is experienced in a certain overwhelming way that almost like something that, and I have to choose my words carefully over here, something that replaces your consciousness as a separate being, and it is replaced by or with a consciousness that is thorough and complete and all encompassing. Perhaps even overpowering. And what is this new consciousness that arrives, or the wrong choice of words, it doesn't arrive, but in fact becomes you. And here again the confusion, how can you become the self? How can the self become you? And it's simply not sufficient to identify with the self. It's not like I identify with a certain community, or my community is that of spiritual seekers. I belong to the community of spiritual seekers. I belong to the community of men on this planet. I belong to the community of fathers on this planet, so on and so forth. No, it's not an identification. It is a complete, overwhelming and total takeover of your consciousness. And to me, it seems to Well, I don't want to interrupt your experience of the self, but perhaps what you noticed is the self is silence. And this silence is not superficial, it is utter and complete. Yes, the mind is silent when you experience the self. In other words, thoughts do not seem to flow, or if they flow, they seem to have little relevance or power. But if I tell you the self is silence, you cannot access the self by becoming silent. You either are the self, and believe me, just let's not bother with splitting concepts and words. There are no concepts, and certainly there are no words that can express the the self is part of you, and you are part of the self. They are not different, and the most obvious explanation of what the self is in fact the correct explanation, and that is the self is who you are. But the funny thing and the weird thing about it is that when you are the self, then you are no longer you. And the realization at that moment, or the experience at that moment, is one of complete and total being. The verb is somehow seems to reflect it. There is an isness to it, and but of course these are comments I'm making from outside the self, so already they have limited validity. Anyway, enjoy. Try to be the self. That is the ultimate goal of all spiritual striving.